Hello, I'm Crystal Petrie. Welcome to another episode of 60 Minutes With. On this week's episode, we are all, and by we, I mean me and you, we are all going to learn about the power and the importance of inclusion at work. We are going to learn about the power and the importance of restorative work culture in a time that those words and those things, maybe there's a target on their backs, maybe not, depending on where you stand on the issue. Either way, you're going to receive the education today on those topics to make an informed decision. And here to educate us on all things inclusion, diversity, restorative work culture, we have Faith Clarke. So welcome to the podcast, Faith.
Hey, Krista. Thank you for having me. That was a fun intro.
Oh, thank you so much for saying yes to doing this podcast. I am very interested to hear and to learn from you about inclusion and diversity because at this point in time with, elections going on and just the noise, there's so much noise that I feel like the education is being buried under the noise. So you are going to help us educate. Now, before we get into the podcast, Faith, where in the world are you?
I'm in New York. I'm in the Hudson Valley area, close to Poughkeepsie. Hailing from the boroughs, the Bronx, moving north to get more trees like Jamaica, where I'm from. So
okay. Oh, you're from Jamaica. How long have you been in America? I should have picked up that accent. I have not this whole time we've been talking. I never picked up that accent. Okay.
Well, Caribbean folk are easy. We do the code switching quite easily. But my daughter is 20 something. So that's what I used to tell me how long I've been here. So I had her here for 3 years.
Okay. Well, we're glad to have you. Now, the first question, let's just hop into this, Faith. Can you describe a situation where a team's combined strength overcame a seemingly impossible challenge or situation?
I think there are lots of those examples. It was very hard for me to think of a specific one. But examples that are near and dear to my heart are examples in the educational system. Often there's a siloed experience in our educational systems. Teachers are working with a student in the classroom, and then another teacher works with that student. And I happened to work with a team that had a collective approach for every single student in the school. So the entire staff team worked together to think about next steps for a student developmentally, socio-emotionally, academic skill-wise, and so on. And then when struggles came up in a particular class, that was brought back to the entire team. So that could have been as simple as not being able to hand in work, but sometimes it was as difficult as complexities at home that resulted in behavior that on the surface looked aggressive, but really and truly, it was a response to a multiplicity of issues. And I think just in my work, life and human issues are complicated, and you cannot have one perspective. You will not solve it with one perspective. So this kind of collective care for one student, I saw that over and over again, really move the needle for that student and helped them be able to take that next step in their own developmental pathway. No one academic staff person could have made that happen.
I am so glad that you said a lot, but one of the things that I'm so glad you said is that there are levels to every person. One person is not just one thing, and I feel like in today's culture, they want you to either be happy or sad, mad or, happy, angry or depressed. Like you have to be one or the other, but humans, and I know in the African American culture, we always talk about that that our experience is not a monolithic experience.
Absolutely.
But that's the case for everyone. No one's experience that's walking this planet is a monolithic experience. Everyone is diverse, everyone has different levels to them. And I
Yeah.
think that's the first thing that people need to realize and accept, that everybody has different stuff with them.
I think too, Crystal, that we know how to handle that difference in most of the spaces we organically occupy. At home, for example, you know that no two children, if you have kids, no two children are alike. If you are part of a sibling situation, you have, your brother, a sister, whatever, you know that they're not alike. You even know that your parents are not the same people with you as with your sibling. what
Absolutely.
what has happened is that the combination of how work has evolved and the industrial revolutions, the commoditizing of human bodies, the kind of mechanizing of human bodies has basically tried to narrow us down to fit into a slot. And so we've created these systems where you are either this or that, in complete violation of how humans are and of how humans show up in the natural spaces that we occupy.
Absolutely. Now, before we get too far into the podcast, Faith, let's talk about the work that you do and how long you have been in this space. Because my audience knows I only get the best of the best on my podcast to educate me and to educate them. So let's talk a little bit about the work that you do and how you got into this space.
Well, I think just first of all, as an educator, I've been in the educational space for all of my career life. So that's more than 30 years. We'll disclose my age, but maybe. And I think specifically in terms of learning experience design in organizational spaces, that's been for the past, I would say, 10 or 15 years. And specifically where inclusion and advocacy is concerned, that's been since the birth of my son. So I have a son who has autism, who's in his mid 20s right now, and becoming a parent of a person with a disability, that basically shifts the landscape of, wait, where will I have place and where will I have space and where will my son and my children have space and place and work, and and so I, as often as my children navigated complex spaces, I shifted my work to do advocacy in those areas. And so whether that was with the parents and guiding them and supporting them, or it was with the organizations those that served those parents, I would put myself in the place to offer support and training for those areas. So now I'm working in organizational spaces because my kids are adults, and my goal is somebody may need to employ children like mine, and how do we help these workplaces be more healthy so that we are not persisting in the violence against humans and letting my children suffer. So that's what I'm doing now.
Okay. The next question I have for you is a two-part question, Faith. The first part, explain to us what is diversity. The second part is, why is diversity of people, diversity of ideas and perspectives so important when dealing with a team?
All right. So diversity is, it's an easy idea because anywhere that you look in nature, you see diversity. Diversity is just difference. And when nature is my favorite example because it's the singleness, the singularity that's created when multiple different parts come together. We know, for example, in agriculture, that the big problem we're having is when we have these massive farms of single crops that's taking out a single element or single nutrient from the soil, throws out the whole ecosystem. That's the same thing that happens in teams. That if you have massive amounts of the same thought process, the same idea, in people, that everybody is saying the same thing, what you miss is the text that's just a part of the, I would say, the design of nature that holds systems together. So you'll see things like narrowed perspectives on problems, inability to see a wide range of possibilities, struggles with creative thinking, struggles with innovative thinking. There is the popular phenomenon, once you have power in the room, this coalescing in thought towards a power thought process. And we don't recognize it as power thought process, but it is safer for many of us as herd animals, if you want to call it that, to kind of stay together and not be singled out. And so groupthink is the kind of phenomenon that shows up, especially when there isn't a diverse, when the group of people working on a project isn't diverse and can't bring their own specific perspective to the situation. So familiar example is the Challenger crash. And it's commonly thought that situation occurred because everybody was kind of coalescing around a main singular thought and unable to see a variety of perspectives that could have solved that problem.
Wow. You said so many things I have never even thought of. So, first of all, nature being diverse. I've never looked at nature as diversity, but you are absolutely correct. Everywhere you look, it's diversity in nature. And that's the beauty of it. People are always talking about how beautiful nature is. That's why it's so beautiful, because of the diversity.
And the stability in nature is because of the diversity. That once we start to interfere, let's think about your garden versus the woods. When we start to interfere, we put this here, we put that there, we force this to be here or that, then we have to spend so much time and effort maintaining the not diverse situation that we've created, because nature is committed to going back to the way it was. We're gonna put in the things that are missing, we're going to, right? And so when we look at our workplaces, a lot of the instability that we're seeing right now, revolving low engagement, people are not satisfied and are now knowing that they have choices, and financially things are all wonky. It's the lack of diversity, it's the lack of accepted, honored, supported diversity of thought, process, and being that's making the system as unstable as it is.
Wow. Oh my goodness. You are dropping gems. And we just 11 minutes into this podcast, Faith. Just 11 minutes in. We're going to stay on team and teamwork for a little bit before we move on. Why is it important for team members to have a clear understanding of the goal, like the end goal? Why is that important for each team member to understand what's going on?
Yeah, I think again, if you kind of think about using the nature analogy, since we're working there, whether the understanding is explicit, as in a person is able to say it, or just implicit, it's part of what they do, it fits within a larger picture. We don't have collective goals executed if everybody isn't doing their part. And so I do agree that everybody needs to know, but I do think that knowing doesn't have to be in the traditional forms of being able to say it or write it out. That there is a way that when we're in teams, when we fit together and almost are synchronized or almost like choreographed together. And so part of what's really important is for someone to know, the team lead or leaders, a bunches of people, and then for people to act as the joints, the connection parts, the almost like the conductor in the orchestra, to say your part comes in here and your part comes in here. So there is an importance of holding the big picture, holding the goal, but not necessarily the importance of every single person knowing the big picture goal, because that's not always possible, right? What's important is that the choreography, the direction, the guidance, the support be adaptable and fluid, so that how this part connects with that part has a bunch of options, and then there's guidance on how to make that happen.
So are you saying, because in the workplace, you hear this all the time, and I'm sure my listeners have heard this all the time. The manager, the supervisor, they come in, they tell you bits and pieces of it, but they never tell, I'm not going to say never, but they don't tell you the entire thing. And some of the employees get upset because she didn't tell me everything. She only told me this part. But sometimes that's needed, correct? If I'm hearing what you're saying.
So there are two things here, and I'll just hint at the second thing first, which is that in organizations, knowledge hoarding is a power move. And so sometimes it's about, yes, it's not necessarily needed, but sometimes it's also about the higher up you are, the more information and knowledge you get. And there is some need to know basis, but the need to know is not necessarily defined based on the role as much as on the where in the hierarchy you are. And that's not explicit. It's just built into some of our organizational structures. And I do think that we should push back against that, that there is something about access to knowledge that's freeing, and that's a part of justice, right? People need to be able to know the things that affect them. I also know that it's not possible in massive systems for everyone to know everything, and that that's a burden on people that's not necessary. And the head knowledge isn't the knowledge that creates improved performance. It's embodied knowledge that creates improved performance, right? And so it's not important for me to know everything about how the roads work, how the traffic systems work, even how my car works. I need the embodied knowledge in terms of my own ability to drive. What I've noticed is that within teams, when people's kind of understanding of the work, the reason for the work, the mission, and their hearts are aligned with each other, that knowledge is much more important than who can repeat the objectives, the goals, you know what I mean? That's much less important. And some people, especially given learning styles and personalities, some people will be like, keep that stuff away from me. I'm a big picture person. That's me. I will improvise in the moment based on my knowledge of the big picture. Some people, other people, they want the details. And back to diversity, how do we honor all the differences of people and the knowledge levels that they want that helps them be productive? I'm the kind of person that needs all the background information. I don't want the details in the moment. I want background. Okay. So it's what kind of knowledge do people need? And how do we honor that versus who at what level should have what information?
Okay, so I have a couple follow-up questions to that, Faith. My first follow-up question, okay, as the supervisor, as the president of the company, how do you know what information to give without being an information hoarder? Because, you know, you think that's security for you. I'm gonna keep this information to myself because that's job security. How do you know what information to give and when to give it? And my second question is, how do you figure out how your employees want to receive information? You stated, Faith, that you want the background information. Some other employees may not want that. Just tell me what I need to do and I'm good with that. So how do you figure those things out as a team lead, a manager, a supervisor, a president?
Yeah, I'll answer the two questions together. Okay. We have to switch from an industrial model of how humans work, like machines, like piece parts that we plug in, to a model of nature, of something that's alive, right? And so if I have a bunch of human beings that I care for their lives about, and they are working together with me on a mission that we care about. So I've stripped away corporate, industrial, shareholders. I'm not saying those things aren't important, but we do need to align to something more fundamental first to figure out the answer to the two questions. How then do I want to be with them in this shared work? Well, it's not just me. How do I give information? Which information should I give? No, this is not relationship. The moment you switch to this is now relationship, then it's, what's the conversation I'm having with people? What's the shared agreements that we need to be having with each other? If we don't let go of the top-down hierarchical machine structure, then we won't enter into the dialogue that's needed, the relational structure that's needed to help us understand each other. So the second question, how do I figure out? By talking. And you know, the teams that do this fairly well, I think it's a sport team. But see, sports teams know that the bodies, it's the actual physical body that is needed for the person to perform. So everything that impacts that body, it matters. The relationships outside, whether they're sleeping or not, whether they're eating or not. So a good coach and good team members get to know each other really well. And they're like, this one is this way with this kind of weather, so I need to run this side. Like we can't avoid, if we want to really work well with humans, turning on our radar and getting to know each other really well, just like we do in our families. When families are working well, we basically spend a bunch of time saying, oh, this is how my brother is. So if I want this thing to happen, I'm gonna do it this way because this is how he is. So this is the same kind of knowledge we want to be taking into the workplace. And then apply that to knowledge, apply that to risk, apply that to structure. And I understand that this is a difficult thing to do if you are in charge of an organization that has, I don't know, 10,000 people. It doesn't, you can't from the top just completely toss out the old system. So this needs to be practiced in twos and threes so that you can figure out again how in our work do we use a relational lens to understand each other so that then we can figure out decision making in not using the old methods, which is hierarchical, dictatorial.
Okay. Faith, if organizations, if presidents that are listening to this podcast, that are watching this podcast, if they want to get in touch with you, have you come out, train, teach, coach, how can they do that?
Sending me email is the easiest way, faith@faithclarke.com. Usually I start just with a dialogue to hear what's going on. And so that's not an engagement. That's just me listening. And depending on what I hear, I may have some suggestions and some solutions. If they're easy solutions, I'm happy to just talk and say, hey, try this, try that. But if they're more complicated and require, some kind of intervention, then a visit or like a deeper inquiry would be what's needed, and we would discuss that.
Okay, so if anyone who's listening, watching, if you want to get in touch with Faith and speak to her more about inclusion, diversity, a lot of the stuff that she's already spoken about, give her an email, faith@faithclarke.com. Now, my next question, Faith, what does poor communication do for a team?
Yeah, so it depends on what we call poor communication, because I do think that a lot of the communication fumbles, and since my brain is using sports right now, you think about a pass and the ball dropping, right?
Right.
There's an intention that is missed or something in the environment shifted, and then the ball drops. That's a lesson, right? So there's something to be learned. And I think, again, my sports teams, that's a good example of, they would watch that video over and over again. They'd be like, what did we not understand about you, about me, about the weather, about the ground, about the person, about the other team? What's to be learned? And so poor communication is really an opportunity to design something new, to understand something better. If we don't take that opportunity, what happens over time, repeatedly dropping the ball, outside of the performance loss, right? We don't get any scores on the board or whatever the issue is. Human beings don't do well with this persistent sense of loss. What we do then is blame somebody else. The poor person who was holding the ball when it dropped, instead of acknowledging that this is a system problem, we all didn't understand something in that moment. What happens in many corporations is that we blame the person holding the ball, not taking responsibility for the system. And so people can't handle that over long term. Either that person is pushed out or that person excludes themselves. You have a whole bunch of quiet quitting. You have a whole bunch of low engagement and things like that have to do with simply not being able to have shared information, which is poor communication. Basically just means there is no shared information. It's some is over here, some is over here, and the passes aren't happening together. Low engagement, but it also leads to conflict. And then conflict is costing organizations a whole bunch of money, because the feeling of not processed conflict takes up so much energy from people that is affecting productivity and innovation and all this kind of thing. And people just don't feel safe. So they're just trying to keep themselves together, pay their rent, their mortgage, send the kids to school. And so their engagement drops. They're just kind of holding back. And it's having a lot poor communication, as in not taking advantage of the opportunity to build and grow, is having impact across the board.
How does poor engagement impact companies? So we're talking about employees that, okay, I'm just here to work, to get my paycheck and go home and nothing else.
It depends on what that work, get my paycheck and go home and nothing else looks like, right? If that looks like, getting the job done completely, then that's fine. Mm-hmm. But often what it looks like is, I am going to do the minimum to not get fired or not get, some kind of, demotion or whatever it is, right? And if a person is doing the minimum, let's just use an average salary like $50,000. I don't know if that's average, but it's an easy number. If you are paying someone $50,000 for the year and their engagement is at half, you are wasting $25,000. So that's the very basic is that low engagement is costing companies money. Now, the sad thing is that the companies are causing the low engagement. So they're costing themselves money. It is not that the person, often people come in with all the enthusiasm.
Yes.
Especially if they want. Like they come in like ready, like this will be different. How quickly they see it's the same. And so they get into a self-management type of thing where I just have to cope. I can't allow this thing to take all of my energy, right? So I'm managing myself. But what that means is that their best wisdom is not available to the organization. And it's a loss of money, but it is a loss of so much more because the human beings putting their brains together can solve any problem. But, when we're not allowing each other to kind of really shine, then we don't get the value from that person that could be gained for the organization.
What do you feel when people say, who you work with is like a family? I don't agree with that. I prefer that, it be likened to something like a community or a neighborhood, but not family. I feel like that's really personal when you're like your family. It's really personal. It should be separated or split, but you're the expert here. What do you think on that?
I think there's so many kinds of families that it really all just depends on what we're thinking about. Here's the reality though, Crystal. Whether we call it family or not, when you spend 10 hours a day with a person, you bring them home with you at night. You bring the stuff they've said to you home. You bring the feelings that you've dealt with them home. And so whether we acknowledge that they're like family or not, they have enmeshed themselves or we have allowed them to become enmeshed in the ways we are at home. And when we don't acknowledge that, then that's even worse, And so part of the question has to be, what kinds of relationships do I want to have with people who are at work? And how do I curate and cultivate those relationships so that they are healing to me, so that I'm bringing healing home, versus them being toxic to me and me pretending that toxicity ends when I walk out the door at 4:30 or 5 o'clock or whenever it is. I am absolutely bringing that home to whoever is there. And therefore, my family is experiencing this other person, these other people through me, even when, they're not there. So.
Oh, wow. That was excellent. Excellent. Okay, so Faith, we hear this all the time. You got to trust your employees and trust your employers. But how do you gain trust? How do you build trust in a team environment?
Yeah, that's hard. Trust is fundamental to effective teamwork. And trust has a couple of different components because there's the emotion of trust, but there's also trustworthiness, like the actually people doing things when they say they're good, that builds trust, right? And the reality is that most of the trust that we walk into an organization with is already kind of preset by the environment we've been in. And so let's just use the racial tensions that have been present in the United States forever, but right now they're being talked about. Context where there's a lot of racial and supremacist kind of conversations and polarization, the environment is low trust. That's a given. So when that person, whoever new employee is, walks into a job, if the leadership there wants to build trust, they have to know that their employees have had many, many, many reasons not to trust. Racialized employees have had many, many reasons not to trust and have allowed themselves to trust and have felt the consequences of that, because trust means being available in a vulnerable way. And that has to be two-way. And so many, many people have been in situations and relationships where they have trusted and have not been reciprocally trusted. And so they have experienced harm. So to get effective teamwork, we need to be eyes wide open about the reality of not of why would I not trust? What I need back to my kids and this mortgage and stuff like that, right? So if I trust you, open up to you, I could lose this job. Racialized people, people with
Right,
marginalized
right,
identities are at risk so much more than their counterparts who have power
right.
identities. So where is the risk in the relationship? Often with the racialized, often with the marginalized identity. So then people always ask me, whose responsibility is it to build trust? I'll say the power identity. Yes, the person with the racialized identity does have a responsibility to also come in with an open heart. But if you have a power identity, that's leader, that's an ethnic identity, that's majority or not marginalized, white, or
Correct.
if you're male, or if you hold any of the power identity, understand that you have the ability to kind of lead in trust building in ways that people with marginalized identities have been so exhausted that they can't. There's too much risk for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one of the key ways of building trust is to be vulnerable, but to ask people who will be harmed by vulnerability to be vulnerable, that's not the way. So, you be vulnerable. You acknowledge that this may be hard for you because of XYZ. You acknowledge that your personality, you are more of a morning person than an evening. Whatever the thing is that you can acknowledge as a leader, you acknowledge that and set the stage for the trust building, and just allow people to see that you are a person who is trustworthy, that when they are vulnerable, there is no harm that comes back to them. And it's a slow game. It's a slow game, but it takes intention. People are not going to trust just overnight.
Nor should they.
Yep.
Nor should they. And you explained that wonderfully. But I'm just going to say it's also not fair. It's not fair for the power entities to expect for the employees or the marginalized employees to be vulnerable and to open up and to be truthful and honest to you, and you don't reciprocate. It's not fair at all.
Yeah, it's not fair, and it's a representation of hierarchy. People below open up to people above. People above are not open, people below are. That's how hierarchy works. And so, think about who, like, aside from whatever leaks out in social media, what do we know about what's happening for King whoever and
Right.
Queen, right? So, not right. And even when we look at how when racialized people's business gets exposed in socials, we can see how much social vitriol is meted out to people who are racialized versus people who are not, right?
Yes.
So it is part of hierarchy, and upsetting that and turning that over means I must recognize that. And so through the lens of every power identity that I have, so my kids are neurovariant, they have, their brains may work differently, so as a power identity I am considered neurotypical. I then get to be the person that builds trust, to be intentional about building trust with people who may be neurovariant, who may be neurodistinct, right? And so we all have that potential because we all have power identities, and we can practice this vulnerability and this humility through the lens of our power identities, all of us. And then, of course, through the lens of our marginalized identities, we learn how to care for ourselves and be safe because the vulnerability and the risk is there.
Right. And a lot of times, and then we'll move on to our next subject, Faith, but a lot of times, marginalized community, African Americans have been vulnerable, have been open, and it's bit them in the butt. It's been used against them. It's been used to tear them down or make them seem as though, they're not effective employees, or they start doing paperwork to get them fired because, I'm being vulnerable, I'm being open to you. But then you use it against me, and it goes back to something you said earlier that, people have had lives and previous hurts and previous letdowns when they walk into your building. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about restorative work culture. What is restorative work culture?
So I've coined that captures a couple of ideas in the work I do. And so first of all, I'll just say culture, that the culture of any collective, of any group of people, is just the ways that they think and act and maybe feel automatically. It's the stuff that's habitual.
Okay.
And one element of culture is meaning making. We mean when we say a thing is just cultural. I can be talking to some Jamaican friends and I say something and everybody knows what I mean. That's not present when I'm talking to, say, colleagues or maybe my Black American friends, right? So meaning making, feeling, thinking, acting on habit, that's culture. What's happening in your workplace is culture, and that culture can be emerging or it can be designed. I'm saying to people, design it, because don't let the thing that's active in the bigger culture, it must, if you don't design it, the thing that's active in the bigger culture will show up in your workplace. And if you want that, that's fine, right? But if you are saying that, you know what, I want to honor humans, I want a workplace that's kind and all this thing, then recognize that that's not the culture of the business structures we've inherited, and that's not the culture of the wider environment, right? A restorative culture is a culture that is at least equal in what it gives and takes.
Okay.
And what we've had is an extractive culture. What basically, give me your effort, your sweat, your body, your energy, your work, and we will keep it and give you nothing in return. What you will get in return is hardship and loss of your life force and so on, right? And so, and the lower, again, back to hierarchy, the lower down you are, the more that is present in your experience. So if you want a restorative culture, you have to deliberately be anti-extractive culture, right? How do you set things up so that the human beings in the space are honored as much as the technology? I've stepped into some offices and some buildings where the technology is so sexy, it is so amazing. And the room has to have special temperature because the thing to work the way it works, and you special staff to care for the thing so that it works the way it should work, right? The knowledge that we take into being with our technology, our machines, is the knowledge we need to take to being with the humans that are doing all the things. So how do humans work? What makes humans thrive? How do humans benefit? How do we set up compensation, work environment, relationships, workflows, work arrangements to align with how humans work? That's the question that generates a restorative culture.
Okay. Oh, this part of the podcast is about to be interesting. Okay, so how can restorative communication encourage individuals to take ownership of their actions and their impact to others?
So I think if you think about restorative culture as this kind of nourishing ecosystem, and back to your question on communication before, right? Bad communication. Restorative communication now is communication where the intention is good. The intention is nourishment, right? So it is this, you cannot have restorative communication without an initial taking responsibility. And I will take responsibility for several things. I will take responsibility for the impact. I will take responsibility for my intentions. I will take responsibility for the power that I hold in this conversation between us. I will take responsibility for the history that I bring, marginalized or otherwise. All of that, instead of just letting it happen without us being aware of it, I will take responsibility for all of that. And then we'll have a conversation where I hold all of those things at the same time. And this takes some practice, right? Because especially if you have a power identity, you're not used to taking any of that kind of intentional thought. Right. You're like, people should just listen to what I've said and all this kind of thing, right? And so instead, both parties come to the table with a full sense, or all parties come to the table with a full sense of who they are as people, and then who the community is that they're creating. And then they communicate with that intention, with the freedom to stop and say, hey, I'm not sure. Did you say so and so? I'm not sure. This felt this kind of way to me. How, and the willingness to kind of dialogue about the dialogue until you get that rhythm of communication right, that it actually feels good. Because people coming together aren't going to kind of automatically fall into a process that feels good and restorative. You need to be skillful in your listening. You need to be skillful in your self-awareness. You need to be skillful in your self-management. And you need to really be noticing your impact on others and take responsibility for that. So those are the prerequisites to restorative communication.
I feel like a lot of what you're saying, if I'm understanding it correctly, listen to me with my restorative communication self, is when people listen to respond versus listening for understanding. And a lot of people listen to respond, meaning I'm talking, I'm being vulnerable to you, I'm saying I don't understand this or I messed up here. And you're busy thinking that, okay, I'm going to say this, I'm going to have this to say, this is going to be my response, instead of listening to actually understand and empathize what I'm saying.
I think that I'm not going to be able to respond well if I don't understand. So I see those two things as the same. I've always heard that listening to respond versus listening to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, if I don't understand, my response is not a helpful response. Communication is this back and forth from your brain to my brain and back, right? And what I'm saying is just not going to land in you if I don't understand what you're saying to me. And so for me, even the intention to respond has to be about respond to who? You, right? Respond about what? The entire context of the thing that you are talking about that has to do with your perception, your understanding, your context, your culture, right? And so it is about this broadening, not the monolith, but this broadening of what are all the information that I'm taking in. And then, based on all that I've allowed myself to take in, what would I want to offer you that will help you and help us move this thing forward?
Okay. I understand that. What are some restorative communication techniques that you can give us, give me, give my audience to help rebuild trust and even build trust?
And so again, as we had said earlier, it starts off with the intention, and we've been in situations where intention has been expressed but not lived.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the first thing is that the intention to be nourishing, to not harm, to be different from other workspaces needs to be expressed over and over and over again. I saw a post recently about radical invitations, and basically what the speaker was saying was that marginalized people who are used to not being allowed to be in particular spaces, are used to not having space, must be radically invited over and over again for us to even believe that that's possible, right? So number one step, if you do nothing else, the intention to not harm in communication needs to be expressed over and over and over again. And with that intention is the openness to say what in this communication has felt any kind of way to you, and what can I do about it? Expressing the vulnerability of I'm not sure how to do this well. People ask me often, just like you asked, what are some specific things that I can do? The thing that's restorative for Faith may not be the thing that's restorative for Crystal. And any effective communicator knows that we speak to the audience. You communicate with the audience. So the second thing is who are you talking to? Who's your audience? How do you get to know that person really, really well? So oh, Faith loves to talk about her children. So if I'm given an example about a thing and I can relate it through the lens of parenting, that might be a way to get through to Faith. Like, how do you really use the fact that we want to get to know each other well? So it's a relational model, I would say. So your intention, what kind of relationship are you trying to build? And then number three, what kind of space do you create for repair? Because we are going to make mistakes. So normalizing repair, initiating acts for repair. Like I think I might have messed up. I'm not sure. Like, help me understand. But even if, I am sorry that I said something or we did something that felt some kind of way. And normalizing repair without retribution in any way, and when I say retribution, I don't mean firing. I mean I mean, loss of social credibility. I mean, feeling like, no, you're this
Yes.
person doesn't want to meet eye contact with you in the corridor,
Yes.
that kind of thing, right? Without feeling exposed. Like we had a thing that happened in a meeting, and you don't kind of just work it out in with me in the meeting, but maybe you take me aside and we talk about it. And in the public, you make it clear that we're still in good standing. All
Yes.
of that is restorative because you are protecting me and protecting my social credibility in the space. The examples like those. Yeah.
You know what? A lot of the stuff that you are talking about is so spot on, but I feel like it's going to take a mental shift, number one, and it takes a lot of effort. I
Yeah.
don't know if people want to do either. I don't know if people want to change the way they think. I don't know if people want to put in the kind of effort and the time that it's going to take to have a diverse board, or have restorative work culture or restorative communications within the building, even though the end goal would be amazing. The end goal would be amazing.
Yeah, I think no, in some cases people don't, right? And I tend to work with the people who do, because for the people who want it, we still don't know how, because we've lived in this culture where it's not been done for so long.
Mhm.
I think that the more people who do it, the more of a case of how the world could be we get to see. The more that happens, the more the toxicity of the other way will be untenable. Like we see what happened with the pandemic in terms of work. That
Mhm.
what we saw was people got more flexibility, people got a bunch of experiences quickly. And what that meant was that people were no longer willing to put up with a certain kind of inflexibility at work when the work conditions, shifted. More experiences like those will shift the landscape. But I also think that the world is shifting in a way that's, we talked about instability before, right? That it's going to become just not sustainable to maintain these systems without force. Like we gave up maintaining hierarchical systems with force, and now we're using another kind of force, like a financial force and that kind of thing. But it's going to become clear that outside of coercion and manipulation, you can't maintain the system. And so, whether because of a moral, ethical reason or because financially it won't work, people are it's coming, right? It's emerging, and people are. On the other hand, research says it quite clearly. Mental health issues are medical expenses within an organization, whether that's expenses for insurance or expenses for sick days and missed days or productivity drops, are so much lower. They drop when organizations are more supportive and nourishing of the people on board. People actually are able to work more, not because they're working more, there's more work that comes out at the same time. So there's all kinds of research that we've seen. It's just that we need to be willing to shift. And so,
And
as you
that's
see,
where you come in.
and time too, right? Because what's going to happen is that younger people, my kids, are much less tolerant of what happens in work than I am.
Hmm.
I will go into work and my kids are like, what? No. And so what we're also seeing is that as the generations come on, they're like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. And in 20 years, the workplace is going to have to look different, because the 10-year-old coming in now is going to be 30, and they're going to be like, yeah, yeah, no.
You have been in this space and been working in this space for several years, Faith. We're not going to age you. At this point in time, what is your intention in the organizational health, the teamwork space, the inclusion space?
Yeah, my intention is to help the leaders that want to do this shift. It's almost like build the mental agility around the how, because we've learned a particular way for so long. It's almost like it's as you said, it's a mind, it's like it's a mind bend. And so when I'm working with teams, I'm not giving solutions, because I think the human way is not to say, here's the prescription. That's the mechanized industrial model. The human way is to be in the ecosystem and build your ability to notice and see what the ecosystem is asking you to do. And so my intention is just to build that capacity within people to turn on again their ability to listen deeply, to turn on again their ability to feel what's happening in the space and to know what the humans need, to turn on their humility and their vulnerability, to turn on compassion at work, to turn on belonging at work, and to let those things be in the work ecosystem and see the benefit of those things show up in the relationships and how we work together.
Okay. Let's talk about, pivot here. This is a hard pivot too, to how the slave work model from, 1619 on really is still in effect with the work model that we see today in 2024, 2025.
And yeah, I mean, I could even go further back, right? That the slave work model, as horrible as it was,
Mhm.
I mean, the complete objectifying and dehumanizing of humans is what was needed to make slave the mechanism of the slave trade work. But if you look back to its predecessors in European contexts, you see like the serfs and the lords, and there is this way that the hierarchy basically said there are those who have, and the ones who have, take care of, own, have the right to say things about the lives of the ones who don't. And if the ones who don't try anything to have more than they are supposed to have, they are punished for that aggressively, right? So that model existed, and then they kind of deepened it, codified it, made it into laws even more into the system that we have in terms of the capitalist system of slavery. And I think when we don't recognize that taking from people, utilizing their labor, like all of those elements, and then we don't recognize that owning power for ourselves, owning the byproduct of the people's effort for ourselves, etc., and creating that structure. If we don't recognize that structure, then we can't see it in the work model. So yeah, you had slavery, you have the industrial revolution, and the industrial model is the same. The business structure where you have, the business owner and then the people who have been employed, and then the salaries that are given to people who are employed is dependent on whether we think that labor is something that's productive or not. So we've already determined that labor that's productive, similar to how we determine the value of a slave, labor that's productive is labor that produces this thing that we can sell back for this amount of money. So this person who's cleaning the bathroom, or this person who is doing the mail sorting, is less quality productive labor than this person who is, doing this, making a widget. And so this whole value hierarchy of human beings based on what they produce, and even our own defining of produce at product byproduct, even our valuing of it, somebody gets to say what's that value. Because if I was valuing it, I would value the house cleaning more, right? But I don't get to be the one determining the value. So there's a person. That entire model is the same model. And when we are building these restorative structures, what we have to ask ourselves is, where is that model embedded in my system? Is it embedded in the job descriptions? Is it embedded in the performance analysis? Is it because it's not overt. We're not saying we're supremacist thinkers. No one is saying that. No one even overtly agrees with that. But what's happening is that somewhere in the you didn't do this thing the way I asked you to do this thing is a judgment about your difference, and a prioritizing of a certain way of being, which is the supremacist structure. So instead of a curiosity about, wait, Faith, how does your brain work? What we're basically saying is, no, actually, you should be like this. If you're not like this, then you're either bad or wrong. Right? And that's the same system. So the curiosity around where the system is now embedded, layers deep in tools, in technology, in software, in business practices, is what we actually need right now.
Let's kind of stay on that subject of what some people consider low wage or not important workers, the person that picks up the garbage or whatever, and I often wonder, and this is such a tangent, then I'll get to my question. I often wonder because I love sports, we've been kind of talking about sports. I love sports. And I always wonder after celebrations when all of the confetti and the trash and like who comes to clean all of that up? That person or those people are the most important people because you have to come behind all of the fans, all the players, the confetti, the balloons, the wine, the champagne, and clean all of that up as if nothing ever happened. I
Right.
always think like, who are those people?
Yeah.
Now those people are the most important people. Okay, so to my question, how do some modern day work systems, particularly again in the low wage sectors, or someone has determined is the low wage sectors, create cycles of debt that restrict worker mobility?
I mean, that's a complex system.
Hmm.
And I wouldn't even start it with low wage.
Okay.
I would say that because of where different people have fallen in the hierarchy
Okay.
and what has happened for them ancestrally, then they've ended up on the game board of mobility, a particular place. Right.
Yes.
And so the fact that, I had this conversation recently that an African American six-figure earner woman and her white female counterpart, same six figures, those six figures do not mean the same thing. Because this
Hmm.
woman, not in the spending of it.
Okay.
It's similar to, I'll give a simpler example. My son got $200 as a gift, and his $200 got in Converse. And
Okay.
like if I got $200 as a gift, that would get me gas and a little bit of groceries. Right? The money that we get fits into our lives within the context of the support for that life that you have. If you're a person, no kids, your life is fully supported by the environment you're in, your mobility has been, your path has been charted by the people who have come behind, whatever, you're completely different at 200,000 than a Black woman, lots of education, which therefore means lots of debt, whereas her white counterpart probably does not have as much debt as she has. A Black woman probably means she is supporting family members, not just her own kids, but other family members. Likely, for a variety of reasons, there have been people in her family who have not been able or willing to support their own family members, and she's opted to step in. Likely, she's also caring for an aging parent or an aging aunt, right? This
Yes.
person, $200,000 is different, right? So where you are in the board is a factor, and your own kind of where your power dynamics and stuff. And then are you earning minimum or not or whatever. So I do think that it's a complex issue. And if as an organization, when organizations ask me questions about, say equitable compensation structures, I'm like, it's a conversation, it's not a formula. You have to find out what's important to me and what's happening in my life and what I'm working towards. And then you have to figure out, based on what you can afford, how you can help me move the needle on the things I am committed to. So it's not just like a rubber stamping medical insurance or rubber stamping whatever. It has to be more custom. Like me in my life, I have a massive student loan debt. And you probably could use the leverage of your organization and address that in a way that I, as an individual, can't. So your medical insurance, while lovely, doesn't get my $100,000 of student let off my back. I, I think there's an innovation that's needed that has to be individual custom to think through what are the things that are affecting humans and how do we address them. So it's not simply a matter of the minimum wage or I do think that there is a principle approach that's needed. We have tons of data that says in the US what's required for people to live comfortably. In each state, we have that data for state, a single person, a household of four. I think it's unethical for organizations to be offering people less than we know would be helping them to live comfortably. So I think first and foremost, we need to redesign how we're doing our compensation so that we are not offering people If we take up full-time time of a person's time, we should not be offering them something that cannot meet their needs in the country that your business is operating in.
And you know what? My takeaway from this interview with you, Faith, has been really thinking outside of the box and customizing per person. Like looking at the whole person and how you, and learning how to communicate to that person, learning how to receive communication from that person. And you know, when with jobs, it's like, okay, I'm gonna give you this much money, and I don't care about anything else in your life. Whatever else is happening in your life, that is not my concern, and I don't care. I'm paying you this, and that should be enough. But really, that is not enough.
Cannot be. If we want to honor human beings, that cannot be enough. It has to be that I care. The moment say we start with I don't care, old system, hierarchy, right? I must care because your quality of life impacts my quality of life. We are an ecosystem, right? I must care. And therefore, what I'm offering to you is what I'm offering to myself. And if we don't recognize that, then, you know, it won't work.
Oh my goodness. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We are at an hour. That's the quickest hour of my life.
I'm
That's
glad.
the quickest hour of my life. I feel like I could really just continue to talk and learn from you like for another hour or 2 hours. This has been amazing, Faith. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Crystal, for having me.
Thank you. So, my final question for you, who do you think would make a great guest on the podcast? But you have to help me get them on.
Well, I have done some work and I continue to work with a fantastic group of consultants. And I think anybody in the Avant consulting group could be pretty amazing. Dr. Nicole Avant is incredible in the anti-racism space and microaggressions and the work that she does. And so, but any of the people on her team, I think would also be pretty effective. So that's 2 or 3 people you could,
Yes.
we could invite. Let me think who else. I think there are a couple of educators. I want to think about that because I also think that there are people who are innovating in the educational space in ways to bring greater inclusion. And I want to think about who they would be to kind of make those connections as well. But yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, again, thank you so much for bringing your time and your treasure to my podcast. I appreciate you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And to my listeners, to my viewers, thank you so much as well for tuning in and watching. You can get Faith's podcast and all of my other podcasts on YouTube Podcasts and Apple Podcasts. And remember, you always have time to listen and learn on the go.